Hello, and welcome to the Zicklin Talks Business Series. I'm Paquita Davis-Friday, Interim Dean of the Zicklin School of Business, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Is Baseball Still Our National Pastime? Joining me is Gwen Webb, Associate Dean for Executive Programs, who will moderate the question and answer period. Our guest today is Professor Marc Edelman, Professor of Law in the Zicklin School of Business, Department of Law, and the Baruch College Faculty Athletics Representative. Leading the conversation is Larry Zicklin, retired chairman of Neuberger Berman, an alumnus, our benefactor, and instructor in our programs. Larry, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Paquita. And this is a pleasure for me because I'm a baseball fan. I've been a baseball fan all my life, and I still play fantasy baseball. So I'm knee deep in this. Marc, let's just start. Question before the House is baseball still America's pastime? I'm not sure I know the definition of pastime, but what do you think?
I guess I want to start exactly where you are, Larry, with what's the definition of pastime? If you're asking, is there still great interest in baseball in the United States? Absolutely there is. The teams are more profitable than they've ever been before. If the question is baseball the sport? Football maybe has surpassed it. Basketball is growing, esports are growing, and for a reasonable segment of the American population, attending a baseball game is not even an affordable option anymore, so they might be getting excluded.
Well, one measure that addresses that question would have to be attendance, physical attendance at the game. And in 2000, there were roughly 71 million people that attended. 2007, the high was made of 79.6 million. And in 2022, it was 64.5 million. Does that indicate that interest in baseball is waning?
I don't know. If you speak very basic business, the profit of an entity, the revenue is the amount of whatever you sell times the price. Now, if you look at the price of a baseball ticket, it continues to go up. And the total amount of revenue that's being made in baseball overall continues to go up, even despite what might be looking like a decline in attendance to some degree.
So if you're looking at declining attendance and increasing revenue, that seems to indicate higher prices. And isn't there a limit to higher prices? How much can you charge before people start to turn off? And I mean people other than the people in the luxury boxes.
I don't know. It's been almost an unfortunate real world experience we're seeing with baseball, and certainly with football, and to an extent basketball and hockey as well. I suppose if we presume that the owners of the teams and the commissioners of the sports are realistic, once they feel they'll get to that point, they'll stop raising price. But overall, they seem to be comfortable with the direction that the game is going, even if some fans are not.
Well, according to what I read, the average MLB team is worth 12% more this year than last year, roughly $2.3 billion. Since attendance is down, what are they paying for? They know there's a limit to price, some limit. I don't know where it is, but there is some limit. And yet they're willing to pay higher prices. I think the Angels were about to be sold and the price was canceled, and they were supposed to be getting $2.7 billion. That's more than the $2.4 billion that the Mets sold for. What are the owners buying when they buy a team? Are they buying current earnings, hoping for dividends? What are they paying for?
I don't think so. Larry, from your world, when you talk about valuing a business, and I'm probably oversimplifying it, you're looking at the future revenue stream that you expect a business to bring in. And that would be rational investing or rational purchasing. If you look at Major League Baseball, there are only 30 Major League Baseball teams out there. And unlike in European soccer, in baseball, we operate as a closed league, meaning that you cannot create your own baseball team and through winning over a series of years, move into Major League Baseball. The only two ways of becoming an owner in Major League Baseball is buying an existing team or convincing the 30 existing owners to create an expansion team. And in my lifetime, over the past 45 years, we've only seen 4 expansion teams in Major League Baseball. And they've all emerged at times in which the league has had a serious need to raise revenue. So what we have is we have 30 of these assets that exist in the world, with maybe 1 or 2 of them on the market at any point in time. And we've got a much greater supply of incredibly wealthy people out there who would like to own teams, whether it be for being able to hold up a trophy and say they ran, or wanting control. You said you play fantasy baseball. I mean, imagine that we have several billionaires out there who want to play fantasy baseball with real teams. They want to be the owners of it. And as long as the demand to be part of this unique club baseball owner is greater than the supply, there'll be an increase in market price to purchase a team, even if the financial numbers wouldn't support that.
I would say too, we talking about, of course, the primary source of revenue, ticket sales, but we've also not discussed things like concessions and the things that we see when we go to the stadium with the advertising. And so there are other aspects. Certainly, I agree with Marc entirely that would necessarily make up for the valuation difference between the present value of the future ticket sale revenues and the revenues from those items. But there are other streams of revenue in baseball as well.
No, Paquita, you're absolutely right. And I mean, just for fairness, I mean, up until about World War II, when we looked at Major League Baseball, we were talking about the revenue stream being primarily attendance. We've long since crossed the point in football and basketball, and we're getting close to that point in baseball where attendance isn't even 50% of the revenue. So, Paquita, you make a very astute and fair point here. I mean, we need to look at broadcast revenues. We need to look at sponsorship. We need to look at licensing. And it seems every generation there's a new revenue stream. So I think it's fair from an accounting of value perspective. When you're valuing the asset, we can't just look at that stream out there. Gambling seems to be the new one. What we've seen emerge over the past few years is the sports leagues that used to be opposed to sports gambling have now gone state by state and sought state bills to give them control of the data of their sport and the exclusive right to sell it. And that's now emerging as yet another revenue stream. So I think it's a very fair point that I might have answered Larry very quickly by focusing on the attendance revenue stream, but there are other revenue streams that are growing, and some perhaps even more quickly at CAGRs, at category average growth rates, that are far higher than whatever decline or stabilization we might be seeing in terms of attendance. So that's a very fair point.
Okay, so when a baseball owner buys another team, buys one of the teams, is there a cash on cash return? Do you get actual cash? Is there positive cash flow when you own a team? Forget the futures. Positive cash flow when you buy a team.
The interesting thing is it's the least value. It's the teams that are seen to be the least valuable teams that are closest to or would have the most valuable cash flow in most instances. One that stands out to me is the Miami Marlins. Now, anyone that's followed baseball for a reasonable period of time, knowing the Miami Marlins, which used to be the Florida Marlins, this is not a team which is seen as being one of the stronger teams in the league. And in terms of salary, the Marlins for many years were dead last when they were owned by Jeffrey Lurie and what they paid to their players. But by having so few costs on the book, they have been a team that over several different years has operated with positive cash flow, with positive revenues.
Yeah, but that goes on for a certain period of time. Let me give you an example. I was once asked to join a syndicate that was going to buy the San Diego Padres. And I thought to myself, I would be competing, being a small part of the syndicate, I assure you, I would be competing against people that are in it for the fun of it. They just want to win. You know, the George Steinbrenners of the world. They want to win. They'll spend anything to win. I would like to make a profit on my investment. That seems like unfair competition in the sense I didn't do it because of that. But won't that discourage people from coming in when they know others are in there just for the sport of it? And you can't go in there for the profits, cash on cash.
Well, Larry, that's fascinating. If I can talk soccer for a moment, and we'll come back to baseball, I promise there'll be a point to this story. What you just said now sounds extremely similar to what a former law firm partner at Latham & Watkins said in the 1990s by the name of Alan Rothenberg. And when the United States really wanted to get the World Cup in soccer here, one of the requirements from FIFA was that we create a premier soccer league in the United States. And Larry Rothenberg made the exact same point you made, Larry, that there are a lot of people out there that would love to invest in professional soccer, but they're afraid that if there are different billionaires who are spending a lot more money on the team than they wouldn't be able to operate and make a profit. So Rothenberg proposed a very different model for Major League Soccer than what we've seen in all of our 4 premier professional sports leagues, including the Major League Baseball. Instead of devising the league with individual teams, Rothenberg created a limited liability company, an LLC. And instead of having owners of the teams, Rothenberg proposed a model that people with large sums of money could become shareholders in the LLC. And the goal of this was to align the interest. So you wouldn't be an owner of a team. So Larry, if you invest in this, it's not like you would become the owner of the New York Mets or the owner of the New England Revolution. You would become a shareholder in the entire company, aligning the interests, which was intended to make people indifferent as to which team won. And the goal of this was to make sure that all of the investors had a positive return on investment. And Rothenberg expected that this would lead to a lot of investment in the league. Now, Major League Soccer ultimately had to abandon that model before they even launched. And the reason why they had to abandon the model was Rothenberg turned to people he expected to be substantial investors. He turned to Lamar Hunt, who owned the Kansas City Chiefs in the NFL, who was a big soccer person. He turned to Bob Kraft, who owned the Patriots, who was a big soccer person, and he thought he would get substantial investments, and they both turned him down. And the reason why Rothenberg was not able to fund this model of a league where everyone was a pure investor operator was because the wealthiest of the wealthiest, they wanted to be able to hold up the trophy and say they won. And they wanted to be able to have the control of saying they wanted to make decisions. So the irony here is this model would have achieved exactly, Larry, what you said you would want as an investor in sport. But the people that are actually owning the teams, first and foremost, seem to want control and to be seen as owners, whether it be for ego or to align with other businesses. Hence, even Major League Soccer had to revise its model, and they ended up with something much closer to back to the baseball model. So back to baseball, as we were discussing, it really does seem that even the people without the deepest pockets want that ownership right, which is taking away from that collective interest.
Well, in a way, sport has addressed this, I would think, with the hard cap. When you have a hard cap in the NBA, in the NHL, in the NFL, the owners aren't allowed, by and large, they aren't allowed to just exceed a certain number for player salaries, so they can't go hog wild the way the Mets went this year with a $300 million payroll, which will get to $400 million with all the fines they have to pay. So what about that hard cap? Should that hard cap be employed in baseball?
Well, I think owners in all sports would love a hard cap because the hard cap achieves 2 things, as you suggested. First, with a hard cap, the owners still have that control, that ownership, the ability to hold up the trophy that they really want. But at the same time, it sets the rules when nobody is spending more than a certain amount on salary. Now, the problem with getting a hard cap, and you can look at it under either antitrust law or under labor law. But if you think about antitrust law, presuming baseball is still subject to antitrust law, different debate for a different day, but 30 teams in the league, if every owner gets together and they reach an agreement with one another and they say, we will not pay more than X percent, or we will not pay more than X dollars actively to our employees, that sounds a lot like wage fixing, which would violate Section 1 of the Sherman Act. It's a collusive behavior. The reason why we see hard salary caps in sports such as football is there's a narrow exception to antitrust law, which is known as the non-statutory labor exemption. Now, in good old-fashioned English, for people who are interested in the business side, not the legal nuance, what the non-statutory labor exemption means is if the union agrees to something and the union's part of the agreement, then we deal with labor law, so antitrust doesn't apply. So the reason why in the NFL we have a hard salary cap that's legal is that the union in the collective bargaining process agreed with the teams to implement the salary cap. And we haven't seen a salary cap emerge in baseball because there's a union out there and the union refuses to agree to a salary cap. The union prefers to keep the system in place.
Does that make the fact that the union doesn't agree to keep this in place, a hard cap in place, does that mean that certain clubs are uncompetitive on day one? When the season starts, they really will not have a winning record and you can bet on it. Now, there are exceptions once in a while, I understand, but as a rule, there are certain teams that just can't be competitive. For example, I would name Detroit, can't be competitive. Poor Paquita.
We'll talk about returns on investment as we get into discussions about your Mets teams later on.
Bet your life. But is that right? Are there half a dozen teams that just can't be competitive?
That's an interesting question. We have 30 teams in Major League Baseball, and we don't have all 30 teams that start with an equal chance of winning. Maybe it is, for better or worse, a statement of what American society is. Not everybody begins at the same place. And there are certain teams that are far more likely to win because they have greater resources. Now, with that said, I looked at the baseball standings the other day. I mean, the Tigers, and Paquita, your Tigers are an unfortunate example, even though they have some wonderful young players, and I think the tide is about to turn there. They were a team that was not perceived as being very competitive, and indeed, they haven't been very competitive. By contrast, if we look at the Miami Marlins or the Pittsburgh Pirates, these were both teams that if you asked the sports reporters on opening day, you would say they were done on arrival. And to my chagrin, and Larry, probably to yours as well, both those teams presently have a better record than the New York Mets. And the Mets put more money in salary than any other team in the league. So do all the teams begin in an equal playing field? No. A fair playing field? People probably could say not in that case either. But what we're seeing with the Mets early in this year, what we saw with the Yankees at certain periods of time as well, is simply paying a lot of money, salaries to players does not necessarily secure success. And if we want to talk about my opinion, the most successful baseball franchise over the past generation has been the Tampa Bay Rays, which consistently have one of the lowest salaries in the league, make real use of data analytics in a way that far exceeds what many other teams have done, have always been on the cutting edge, and over the past several years have perennially been winners without superstars and without a high payroll.
Yeah, but what I see, I agree with you about the number of young players, and I would include Cincinnati in that also, a number of good young players. But what invariably happens is these teams attract these young players because of the draft and the inverse draft order that they participate in. And they attract these players, and when these players become matured and really good, they have to sell them because they can't afford to pay them. So I think of Pittsburgh and Detroit, Baltimore, and years ago, had to sell all these very good players. Oakland, for sure, had to sell all these very good players in order to survive. They knew they couldn't sign them to new contracts. It would be too expensive.
Well, Oakland has been doing this for a long time. There was a situation in the mid-'70s, right when free agency began, where the Oakland Athletics took their 3 best player contracts and tried to sell 2 of those contracts to the Red Sox and 1 to the Yankees, and the commissioner had to stop in and try to overturn those moves. What you say that's so interesting is, I think the concern here is not just about wins and losses, but also the continuing to have the players that fans fall in love with on a particular team. I mean, one just that stands out to me, for example, is the Seattle Mariners, which would not be a big market team, would not be a small market team, probably would be somewhere. And Seattle loved Ken Griffey Jr. He was, not only was he a great hitter, but he was
he was a great personality, and the son of Ken Griffey, who himself was an all-star. So it was a great tradition in Seattle. I think Mark has frozen.
That's right.
So for the moment,
Yes. Well, I know one of the things that we talked about ahead of time with this discussion about the power of the players union and the caps, Larry, is just the ability of our players interchangeable. And so you had this question about whether or not teams are uncompetitive. Maybe what we're seeing is that there's a minor league going on within the majors, right? So if you have 30 teams, a percentage of which we know aren't going to be competitive, but they develop the young players that eventually go on to the better teams, maybe that's an extension of the structure of the minor leagues that exists quite extensively in Major League Baseball.
but it must be disconcerting to see fan base in a Pittsburgh and in Detroit, even in Seattle, where Seattle gave up Ken Griffey Jr., one of the great players in the league, because they must have been unable to afford him.
Yeah, and we could talk about the introduction of free agency in general and other leagues, but then in baseball in particular, the need to be able to support or to continue to pay for the teams and the need to sell the players. But this has been a phenomenon in sports, in major league sports for decades now, where in the past we could attach ourselves to a team similar to what we would do for 4 years in college sports. But then as we saw the rise of free agency, players could move on their own, and then with other mechanisms be sold by the owners and managers. And so it's just been harder in general to be connected to a team in particular because of the players. And so now we get more connected because of the location, like me in Detroit, for example.
It would seem it would be in baseball's interest to both have a hard cap and a hard floor, so that teams like Pittsburgh, which has been notably stingy in player salaries and gets compensated from the rest of the league, would have a minimum that they have to pay the players, and every team would have that minimum and a maximum, and maybe they're both the same number for all I know, so that the competitive nature of baseball remains.
Yeah, I think Mark has rejoined us by phone. Mark?
I'm back. Paquita, Larry, and everybody else, I apologize to you. I'm at a conference in Ireland, and I guess Murphy's Law's home is Ireland because we had lost internet briefly, but I am back here.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. Mark, if I gave you all the power, would you like to see a hard cap in baseball with a hard floor?
You know, it's a tough question. I don't think so. One of the things I love about baseball is the storyline of the underdog. I think one of the things that maintains interest in the sport is that there are certain teams out there, like the New York Yankees, that are perennially good or expected to be perennially good. And while it might be unfair, for lack of a better word, that not every team starts in the same place, it leads to this really special level of excitement when certain teams are able to dethrone large market teams like the Yankees. But Larry, I'm not an absolutist on this, and I do believe there are way too many teams that begin with a substantial disadvantage. I think that things like revenue sharing could be used to come closer to equalized team levels. And if we were to talk about a salary cap, I think we also need to talk about a salary floor. So certain owners, such as the owner of the Oakland Athletics, could not decide to invest such limited resources in their team that it would preempt any realistic chance of success.
I would certainly agree with the floor. I would make no exceptions to that floor. Okay, let's move on a little bit and go on to broadcasting, telecasting. Starting in 2022, every MLB team receives a guaranteed $60 million on the national TV deals and another roughly $40 million for local TV. So every team starts out with $100 million. With both TV viewership declining and attendance at the game declining, although this year, 2023, attendance is up, and we'll talk about the new rules later. Is there reason to think that at some future time, this broadcasting contract, TV contract, might be diminished?
I think we're going to have changes in broadcasting overall. It's difficult to say whether it'll be increased or diminished. But if we look at broadcasting, we're having a shift towards OTT. We're having a shift towards over the top. We're having a new generation of fans that prefer to watch games, that want to have access to watch games on apps. And as people become more mobile throughout the United States, historically, cable television has limited people to watching games which are in market. The teams have agreed historically to exclusivity. So if you lived in New York, you would be able to watch the Mets or the Yankees. But until recently, someone such as Paquita, who's a Tigers fan, would not have access to Tigers games. So I think there's going to be a need for all of that to change. And I'm not sure the amount of revenue from broadcast is going to decline the next contract. But the way it's broken up and some of the rules and some of the systems and technology are certainly going to need to change.
My son lives in Los Angeles, and he can't watch, he mentioned football, I assume it's true of baseball too, any games free of charge the way we do in New York, Yankees and Mets. You have to have a subscription.
And I mean, I think that's a problem. I mean, we're moving at least in the right direction that you're caveating that with free of charge. But 10 years ago, if he was out on the West Coast, even for a fee, there would be very limited ability for him to watch Mets or Yankees games. And that, too, is something that could really cost the game fans. When you have people that are really loyal to a particular team, and all because their physical location has changed, they can't continue to watch the team. So, I mean, that is beginning to change. And that's only beginning to change because the owners in Major League Baseball are beginning to change some of their really outdated territorial restraint rules. And I think that's a very good thing.
And just continuing on this broadcasting for a second, there was an Aspen Institute study that said that the number of kids playing baseball dropped like 17% in a couple of years. Is this game less appealing now to kids because it's a little slower than basketball, football, soccer, hockey, whatever you tell me, and maybe a limited attention span forbids kids from watching this kind of stuff?
I mean, that's something that baseball is trying to address by speeding up the games. And as someone who's always been a loyalist to the traditional style of baseball, initially, and Larry, even when we spoke 2 weeks ago, I had some real apprehensions about speeding up the game. In doing my own due diligence in preparation for today, or if you prefer just simply enjoying life, I had a chance to go with Matt LaPierre to a Yankee game a couple of weeks ago. I went to a Met game with Sharif Musa, who's another one of our faculty at Baruch. And I've come to the realization that for an overwhelming share of fans, especially those with young kids or those with families, the speeding up the game is very desirable. But separate and apart from that, when we look at just hobbies and what's of interest, shortly before COVID, Barclays Center sold out the entire indoor stadium for esports, where people watched video games on TV. And it looks like this next generation is very interested in online video games. They're very interested in spending time on the internet. And some of these changes in terms of how the next generation is choosing to spend their time is probably also pushing away from the demand for baseball.
And I will add that with the shift in the length of the game, there's also been in some markets a shift in the time that the games are played, because if you want young children to be interested, you can't have a game that starts at 8 p.m. and ends close to midnight and expect, even with the great attention span, for that to work out, especially before the school year ends.
Absolutely.
And the other thing, the statistic I saw in preparing for this, was that viewership for the World Series, which is the pinnacle of baseball, has declined dramatically since the 70s, when there used to be 44 million people watching each game. And in 2020, that happens to be the last number I saw, the viewership was less than 10 million. That's got to give people pause.
The World Series timing of broadcasts is especially problematic. In order for them to try to keep the games available for people that work regular business hours on the West Coast, it's not surprising on the East Coast for a game in the World Series to begin after 10 p.m. And we've really seen a shift from World War II period when the playoff and World Series games were played on television. Even as recently as 1986, I remember very well Game 6 of the Mets-Astros playoffs. I remember coming home from school at 3 o'clock and the game being on, and then being sent off to religious school and coming home at 6 o'clock and the game still being on and being very wide awake for all 16 innings of that game. And the next generation of fans, especially on the East Coast, do not even have the opportunity to watch games, not just because of the late start times for everybody, but if the game's played on the West Coast, it's even later for those on the East.
Given the decline in the number of viewers, and again, I checked, since 1992, the number of viewers of these games has gone from 22 million to less than 8 million in 2022. So that includes the normal games plus the World Series. Do you think there's a chance, and plus cable cutting, which we know exists, do we see some real problems coming up from this roughly 50% that they get from cable TV, from TV? Let me not say cable TV.
Great question, Larry. And again, it gets me back to where I began, which is, am I concerned about the interest or the ability to maintain interest amongst the next generation of sport in baseball? Yes, absolutely. It's a very real concern. And then you're pointing to it in declining attendance. You're pointing to it in terms of declining watching a broadcast. But on the other hand, and I could be mistaken on this, but I do not believe overall eyeballs watching television and other television programming has grown. You still have all of these companies that are looking to target and attract viewers or eyeballs on the TV screen. Even though there's become greater diversity in who the sports fan base is, it's still seen to be the most desirable television viewership base for men 21 to 45, which is seen as being a very desirable base to try to target products at. And as long as there's a continued demand to pay very real money and increasing amounts of money to advertise on baseball games, even with fewer eyeballs watching, I think we'll still have a pretty sustained period of time in which the leagues will be able to bargain for equal, or if not even, if possibly even greater amounts of money for the broadcast of their playoffs and World Series.
Well, the statistics I've seen indicate that the average viewer of local broadcast is over 55. Now I'm talking TV and not online on some app. And the average is 55, and the average age of the season ticket holder is slightly below that. Is this an indication that kids are not watching? When I was young, that's all you did was listen to baseball on the radio, and when television came, you watched it on TV. But that's not the case now. Kids are involved in many other sports. We didn't have football, professional football and professional basketball to any extent. There was some hockey, but who had a hockey rink in our neighborhood? So it seems to me this there's going to be a split among many different sports, and baseball no longer can maintain its position as to where it was 30, 40 years ago.
I would agree with all that in terms of, if you look at interest in football, baseball, and basketball, the rate of growth of baseball interest is the smallest and potentially even declining. Luckily for Major League Baseball, they are not directly competing for eyeballs during most of their season with either the NFL or the NBA. There's a very limited overlap in the season.
True.
I think the bigger concern for baseball is competing for the eyeballs against other non-sport activities. Are those who would be watching now playing video games, now watching video games, now spending more time on TikTok or Instagram or doing other activities that are not watching sports. And much as you mentioned radio and TV were real boons for Major League Baseball, each of those technologies were usually positive technologies that increased interest in the sport substantially. The rise of the internet and even more so the phone generation might be pushing in the opposite direction, which is creating other forms of entertainment, non-sport based, that are drawing people away from watching the games on TV.
Well, they're going to have to solve this problem. I want to go back to your comments about the new rules, just for the benefit of our audience. There's a whole host of new rules in baseball that came into being in 2023 that shortened the game by 25 minutes or so far. I happen to believe the new rules, especially the rule that says the batter and the pitcher have to face each other, and within 15 seconds a pitch is thrown. I understand 20 seconds with a man on base, but let's call it 15 seconds. I think it's the equal of the 24-second clock in basketball, and will make that much difference, as much difference as the 24-second clock did. I think it's a dramatic improvement in the game, because people like me don't have to watch batters adjusting their batting gloves for 2 or 3 minutes and pitchers walking around the mound and spitting. There's got to be something else. And I think this improvement is just a major improvement in the game of baseball.
I will say I agree. And I'll just think really quickly that we've seen changes in other sports as well, like the tennis, the serve clock in tennis and other places where we recognize that things were taking too long. And initially in baseball, players expressed some not hesitance, but some difficulty with adjusting. But I think that now, as this has been in place for several weeks, that we've seen that they've been able to adjust to this just fine. Sorry, Mark.
And I'm a convert, because again, Larry and Paquita, when we spoke a few weeks ago, I was a devil's advocate. I was the one who was saying that the tradition in the sport is the most important thing, and trying to keep the rules as similar to how they have been is the most important thing. But I pulled the 180. And the reason why I pulled the 180 is I don't think it necessarily matters what my preference is as a very hardcore baseball fan, as somebody who's very invested in history and trying to maintain consistency. I think for the survival of the game, they need to look at where the 90% of the fans are, the potential attraction of these fans. And I do agree that for the overwhelming share of fans of the sport, or potential fans of the sport, the being able to get to the ballpark and getting out of the ballpark a half hour more quickly is really a game changer. And the likelihood of fans, especially younger kids, perhaps being able to stay up to see the end of a game, as opposed to having to shut it off in the middle, which might deter interest in the first place, I think that's very important. So you guys, as long as what I've seen over the past few weeks has really changed my view, and I'm now on board with this.
Yeah, I also think it makes watching the game more interesting, because you're not watching boring things, such as I mentioned before. You're watching actual play. Although I'm interested in the effect this 15-second clock, let's call it, has on pitching, because it seems to me the guys that are out there throwing a ball 95 miles an hour don't have much time to recover between pitches. And it's going to be interesting to see how the injuries pile up to pitchers, whether the older pitchers can still handle it, whether their careers last as long. I mean, this is all in the future, but I think the results of this are yet to be known. We have some questions to be answered, and we'll only know that with time. Do you buy that?
One of the I do. And not only in terms of the age and the body, but one of the interesting things is Major League Baseball didn't just come up with these rules one day and the next day they're the rules of the game. They used a minor league system to experiment with rule changes before they came to Major League Baseball, meaning that not only were fans watching the faster paced games for a few years on the minor league level, but the players who were competing on the minor league level had been playing with these rules. So purely from an on-field competitive perspective, it doesn't surprise me that players who are in their rookie or second year in Major League Baseball have had an easier time adjusting to a rule change that has already been the rules at the level they had played at before. And some of the veterans in the game who've been playing for many years under the traditional rules really seem to be struggling in terms of statistics now that the rules of the game are different.
Well, I have two older pitchers on my fantasy baseball team, and they are not doing well. Let me move you to gambling for a second, Mark. What effect do you think legalized gambling and sponsorships will have on the game?
And again, this is another situation where what might be maximizing short-term revenue is not necessarily, from my view, what's best for the game. In terms of injecting additional revenue into the teams and into the league overall, it's no doubt that both selling statistical information to sports betting sites and having sponsorships with sports betting companies has improved the bottom line of sports teams from the highest to the worst financially performing teams. In terms of the game itself, I've noticed a very big shift in content where it almost is feeling with certain teams, and especially on local broadcasts, that pregame conversations about players have very much been replaced by who should we bet on today. That has become very difficult to watch a game without explicitly or implicitly being a recipient of betting content. And in addition to all of the other reasons in society where we might need to be cautious about encouraging gambling, I do also have concerns that the next generation of sports fan might be engaged in the game as a betting activity and not necessarily as a sport or a human interest activity, and might have more of an antisocial interest in sport. And I think that's concerning not only for society, but I think that's concerning for the long-term sustainability of the sport.
I notice now that there are myriads of ways to bet on baseball. You used to bet on one team or the other team. Now you can bet on how many runs are scored in an inning, whether the player will walk, whether there'll be an error. There's all these multiple ways to bet, which, and I'm assuming gambling is an addiction at some point for some. And are we going to create a new addiction by putting all this stuff on TV for young kids to watch?
Well, I mean, anyone could just make up an opinion, have a hypothesis, and run with it. I think the best way of predicting what will happen in the United States is we had very limited legalized sports gambling until 2019 because we had a statute called the Professional and Amateur Sport Protection Act, which prevented new states from legalizing sports gambling and limited it in Nevada and a few other areas where it was legal before. So we, as compared to countries like England and Ireland and Australia, were very late adopters of sports gambling. So if you turn and look at what's going on in Australia, particularly in New South Wales, which is where Sydney is based, and in Ireland and England, which have had sports gambling on people's phones for a longer period of time, we're now seeing concerns. We're seeing increased rates of addictive gambling behavior. We are now beginning to see all three regions beginning to implement new rules to try to limit problem gambling, increase disclosures. You have England now trying to end sponsorship of gambling sporting events. And this should be a sign in the United States. This should be a sign for the sports leagues as well as a sign for our politicians that we might want to act now as opposed to waiting until we're at the point in time where England, Ireland, and Australia have been for a few years and recognizing a very big problem.
We learn our lessons late. I want to move you to one more place, and that's umpiring. Some of the minor leagues have used the technology that's available to us to even have balls and strikes called by machines, by computers. Do you see technology changing in the game in terms of umpiring?
I think it should. I mean, we've already begun to with instant replay. And we do have technologies to help determine who touches a base first. But much as we talked about before, how the players' union in baseball is strong, and they've pushed very hard against salary cap. The baseball umpires union has historically been strong, and the umpires union has fought very hard against increased technology. I do think this is one of those rare places where the ownership interest in Major League Baseball needs to push very hard in collective bargaining. I do think this is a situation where the interest in the fan and the consumer in the long run needs to be made to trump the interests of individual umpires. And I do think technology should become and ultimately will need to become a more important part of the game just because it's more accurate and there seems to be fan demand for increased accuracy.
Well, you see it in tennis now, where you can see a replay and you know whether that ball was touching the line or not touching the line. And very often calls are reversed because of it.
But the one thing I will say, though, is for this technology to be effective, you need to be able to use the technology expeditiously. And I think tennis is a perfect example of one that is able to use the technology almost instantaneously to correct an incorrect call. At present, baseball has been using technology not to call balls strikes, safe out, but rather they're using it now to have instant replay and have individuals that are based in the New York office look at many angles of a play and uphold or overturn a call. And one of the ironies here is if the goal is to increase the speed of play and new rules are going into effect to make the game operate more quickly, then you want to make sure that the technology is being used in a way that doesn't offset that by sufficiently slowing down the game. And oddly enough, that's where baseball seems to be with its use of technology. You could have 4 or 5 minutes between a play because people in the New York booth are looking to re-review it. And I think we need to get technology to the point where technology is helping the umpires make the correct decision from the incipient and not leading to a delay in review on several calls over the course of the game.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Mark, you mentioned that the new rules were introduced in the minor leagues in baseball. Maybe that's a place that we could start with the technology too, to see how we can integrate it in spring training and the minor leagues before we bring it to the majors.
Well, in minor leagues.
Absolutely
Right,
terrific.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was just expressing agreement with Paquita that I do think the exploration at the minor leagues is a great time to try with new technologies. And at the same time, ownership is going to have to bargain very hard with their umpires. So the umpires cannot work in such a way to impede the introduction of technologies, especially those that are felt to work well on the minor league levels.
Hasn't there been a compromise in the minor leagues where there are umpires, but the technology tells them whether it's a ball or a strike, and there's an instantaneous call because they get the signal? So
that is correct. Whereas in Major League Baseball, the access to the same technology exists, but the umpires unions have pushed very hard against the technology's use.
I'm going to let Gwen in a second. I just want to mention that at the end of this year, Shohei Ohtani's contract is up, and there's a rumor around that I've read that he could be the first $600 million ball player. He could sign a 10-year contract at $600 million, because you're really getting 2 players when you get Ohtani. You're getting a pitcher and a batter, and that could change some of the numbers in baseball. Gwen, you've got questions from our audience.
Yes, there are quite a few questions as usual. The first one I'm going to pass along is actually potentially a bit political. Accepting for the sake of argument the notion that baseball is indeed America's pastime, And that's a question we'll come back to later, but assume that's the case. Is the US colonizing or exploiting countries like the Dominican Republic and Venezuela for their manpower? Or are these countries exploiting our revenue flows? Or maybe there are some mutual benefits.
Are you making me answer this one?
Yeah,
It's
under
a
the threat of torture.
It's a wonderful question. And I mean, to begin with the access to players, you know, on the one hand, it's wonderful to see greater diversity, at least in certain groups in Major League Baseball. We've been struggling to see an increase in terms of African-American players, specifically in America in recent years, but there have been growing increases, especially from one small island in the Dominican Republic, San Pedro de Margarita. I think the question doesn't need to be, is it per se exploitive or per se not exploitive? I think the question needs to be, to the extent that Major League Baseball teams are working to develop international players, are they using the same standards of what would be considered ethical treatment of individuals when they go abroad that we would require in the United States? I don't think this whole integrative social contract theory and saying the standards are below in other countries is appropriate. So, I mean, I think some of the outside parts of this that we could begin to address really quickly are things such as, to the extent that Major League Baseball teams are working with Bisconis to recruit or train Dominican athletes as young as 13 or 14 in baseball, are certain protections being put in place for the long-term well-being of these athletes? Are they ensured a continued education? Are they ensured some type of wage or standard of living in exchange for what they're doing? And I think on the micro level, there are some very real questions and some areas where improvement is perhaps needed.
But let me just add on to that. Mark, do you think there's a time that's coming in the near future where there could be baseball teams in places like the Dominican Republic, which has more great ball players than I've ever seen come from any country?
I mean, that's a fascinating question. I mean, baseball has experimented briefly. I don't think we will see baseball on this level at the Dominican Republic, even though we have great labor, great players there. I'm not sure that there are financial resources to sustain a team that would compete with a Major League Baseball team in terms of the amount of money and the amount that they could charge the fans for different things.
How about Japan?
I do think Japan certainly could, without a doubt. I mean, I think something that would bring really great interest to the game would be if somehow our champion, our World Series champion, would play the winners in Japan. Even within, I mean, amongst places where it might be more plausible, there was an experiment when the Montreal Expos were looking to leave Montreal before they settled in Washington Nationals. There was experimentation with them playing in Hiram Bithorn Stadium, which is a great traditional stadium in Puerto Rico. I wouldn't rule out the possibility of perhaps a team in Puerto Rico. I do believe there's a possibility that perhaps Mexico City, Mexico Ciudad de Mexico, might be able to sustain a team. It would be really interesting if political climate were ever to change, if there would be possibility of having a team or multiple teams on the island of Cuba. But I don't think any of that is coming in the very near future.
Gwen.
There are a couple of questions here that deal with a similar topic. Has Major League Baseball begun any initiatives besides the new rules to engage fans and gain potential fans via social media or other novel programs or media that appeal to the younger generation, especially in view of their shorter attention span and online presence?
And you have pretty much every team in the league is now trying to provide access to their games over the apps, directly to phone, at least in local markets. So that's one. One thing that I very much applaud, and I point this out not only as a sense of innovation, but to also the students at Baruch and our students at CUNY that might be listening today. Steve Cohen, who's the owner of the New York Mets, has rolled out a new program that if you are currently an undergraduate college student with an undergraduate email address, you could sign up for $15 tickets to games. I think that is an incredible statement, an incredible way of trying to build the next generation of fans, especially given how many college students are need to be careful in terms of how they spend their resources. I think that is big. Teams now all use Instagram to a growing extent, which I do believe is intended to target the next generation. So these have been some adaptations that we've seen over the past few years that stand out to me.
All right. The next question, I think, is one that's for Paquita. One of the traditions of baseball is that it teaches young athletes about fair play and good sportsmanship. You have a son who played baseball, and I guess other sports. Do you feel that youth baseball still emphasizes fair play and good sportsmanship?
Absolutely. I have experience with Harlem Little League, and there's the support of the community with team sponsorships, there's parent involvement, and the ability for the players to learn about scorekeeping and not just the role they might play on the team, but also managing the team. And we hear terrible stories, unfortunately, about parents misbehaving sometimes in youth sports leagues, but I would say that generally in the organized, established leagues, the focus is on the players and on their ability to be team players.
Just to follow on, do you think that what goes on in major league games also supports these concepts of fair play and sportsmanship?
You know, I appreciate that, especially because we're talking about baseball. I would have to say that, yes, in baseball, I see that maybe more often than we do in some of the other leagues. We have some examples of, again, exceptions in other places, but I would say that we have a pretty good track record in the MLB of good sportsmanship and fair play.
Although
We have some examples that are of the exception, some cheating scandals, but I would say if you think about the number of games and teams over time, those are rarer maybe than in other places.
Although there's an article this morning in the New York Times about players in Major League Baseball who have a penchant for being hit by the pitch. And they've made a career out of being hit by the pitch because they don't get out of the way. And Pete Alonso of the Mets gets hit very often. This time he got hit and he's out 4 to 6 weeks. And
Yes.
Would have been a record-breaking year for him.
That's the risk return, right? So it's possibly a strategy even. So, but there is a risk in that though. So I don't know if it's an example of lack of fair play.
No, but I agree with you, Paquita. I think Major League Baseball, by and large, is a fair game. They do things fairly. The Houston Astros, to the contrary, I guess.
Right. As interesting as this is, yes, Mark.
I think it's improved tremendously. I mean, if you go back even to the 1980s, and if a player gets hit by a pitch, and again, many of the students who are listening might be too young to remember this, but there was a long period of time where if a player got hit by the pitch, the next thing that would happen would be the player would charge the mound and there would be an all-out. And I think Major League Baseball has done a very good job about putting the levels of punishment and suspension in place to deter that from happening with regularity in the game. I think that's a very big improvement from where we once were.
All right, I think we have time for just one last question. And Larry, this one is for you. The title of this webinar is baseball still America's national pastime? Following your discussion with Marc and Paquita, what is your conclusion to that question?
Well, I'm still not sure what America's national pastime is, but I don't think it's America's preeminent sport. I think it's a great sport. Millions and millions of people still enjoy it. Whether it's preeminent over football or the NBA, I'm not so sure. Certainly more people are watching football now than ever, and the Super Bowl is much more important than the World Series. But for me, it's America's pastime.
All righty. I think we'll have to leave it there, although the three of you, I'm sure, could debate that for quite some time. Just very quickly, I want to tell our audience that our July 11th webinar is Artificial Intelligence, Where is it taking us? It will be with Larry and Nizan Pakin and Yafit Lev-Eretz from our law department. And I want to thank you, Larry, Marc, and Paquita, for a really fun discussion.